But we begin with President Biden, who is now recovering in Delaware from a new COVID diagnosis. The president abruptly left the campaign trail in the battleground state of Nevada. Now, the diagnosis comes as new calls for him to step aside from the presidential race are hitting a fever pitch. CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman joins me now. So, Willie, how is the Biden campaign handling this? We know that the president is isolating at home in Delaware. What are you hearing?
Yeah, that's right, Vlad. The president isolated behind the scenes in Delaware at his beach home here. And now the president had to cut short his campaign events yesterday in Nevada. As you mentioned, he was supposed to take part in an event where he was going to talk to Latino voters. That didn't happen because he felt a little unwell. And then a COVID test was done on the president, and he tested positive for COVID-19. The White House says that he's experiencing mild symptoms, a runny nose, a non-productive cough, according to a note from his doctor. But the White House is also saying that behind the scenes, the president is still doing the work of the American people. He said in a social media post that he feels good, albeit with a COVID-19 diagnosis. So the president recovering from this virus that has just really started to spread across the United States, according to the CDC with recent data. I'll also note that the president was on the campaign trail. As I mentioned, he's been facing these calls to drop out of the race. This couldn't come at a more devastating time for the president's campaign, but still, nonetheless, he says he's doing the work of the American people. He's been out and about campaigning, trying to show that he is ready for 4 more years of the presidency, because, of course, we saw that disastrous debate just weeks ago. But the president sidelined off the campaign trail. We have a lid today, which means we will not see the president publicly, and he's set to be at his beach house for the remainder over the next couple of days and through the weekend. Vlad.
And yet, Willie, it seems, and you can tell me what your reporting is suggesting, but that the president, according to some reports I've seen, is now, his language has shifted a bit in how he's addressing those calls for him to step aside. You have some high-profile Democrats, including Adam Schiff, very powerful congressman from California, who's saying that he believes that the president cannot win, cannot beat Donald Trump. Has the language slightly shifted? I understand he's the nominee. He says he is the nominee and he intends to stay in the race. But has the language that he's using, have you heard that that has shifted slightly?
Well, publicly, we really haven't seen that shift quite significantly. The president has said in interviews, at least with NBC News and also with BET, that he was essentially staying in the race, albeit if a health concern made him step out of the race. I will note that he's kind of talked about that there. He has also talked about his age and how him being 81 years old is an open question. It is something that Americans should consider when deciding to vote for him as president of the United States. But the White House continues to push back and continues to say that President Biden will be the nominee, that he should have the support of people in his party to support his 100-day agenda, as a spokesperson mentioned when we reached out to the White House in light of these reports that former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi had confronted the president on a call, that polling would indicate that he wouldn't win the race. And the president reportedly in that call pushed back. So we do see the White House still maintaining that the president is in this race, that he is there to finish the job, as the president has said time and time again, using that campaign slogan, albeit the president has started to talk about his age a lot more on the campaign trail publicly, Vlad.
All right, Willie James Inman, thank you, friend. Appreciate it. For more on those calls to step out of the race, congressional correspondent Nicole Killian is joining us now from the White House. All right, Nicole, what are you hearing behind the scenes?
Well, look, I mean, what we are hearing is what we have continued to hear over the past several weeks since the president's shaky debate performance. I mean, there literally is a tug of war going on between congressional Democrats as to what the path forward should be. We know the president has made clear time and again, including in an interview he just did last night with BET, our partners, insisting that he will continue to stay in the race. But that being said, as you referenced in your talk with Willie, there are more Democrats coming forward, most notably Adam Schiff, saying that he has serious concerns about the president's ability to win in November. Obviously, there are these reports about leadership approaching the president with polling data. We obviously do know that the president met with Leader Jeffries last week. Again, his team insisting that those were private conversations, but that he did share the breadth of his caucus's positions and perspectives with the president, and of course with respect to Leader Chuck Schumer. We know that he did speak with the president at his Rehoboth home on Saturday. Again, our understanding of those conversations is that he too conveyed the sentiments of his members and his office too, kind of pushing back on some of these reports, that he was more blunt and candid in his assessment, saying that that is idle speculation. So obviously, we are at an inflection point right now, particularly as the president tries to recover from COVID. There are some Democrats out there still standing by the president who say, look, this is not the time really to gang up on the president to try to attack him. We need to stay focused. We need to stay united. But as we know, since this debate has occurred, there has been a fracture among congressional Democrats as to their support of the president and, again, how he should proceed or not proceed in this race.
Yeah, Nicole, it's interesting that there had seemingly been a pause on those discussions about whether the president should stay in the race after the assassination attempt on former President Trump. But it feels as if that drumbeat has picked up again, and it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. Nicole Killian for us at the White House. Always great to have you, Nicole. Thank you.
You bet.